Welcome to the Artist's Index. I'm Scott Bishop, your host for this episode. I'm a New Bedford-based singer, songwriter, and sound sculptor making music under the name Scapegoat. I also present the live concert series, Unexpected Music, which features South Coast musicians performing in non-traditional performing spaces around New Bedford. The In Focus podcasts are generously sponsored in part by Heavenly Spirits Importers and funded in part with grants from the New Bedford Cultural Council and the Fairhaven Cultural Council, local agency supported by the Mass Cultural Council, a state agency. I'd like to invite our guest to introduce himself and talk a little bit about himself and what he does.
Hi, I'm Paul Bielatowicz. I am a guitar player and more recently composer, I guess. I play guitar for Carl Palmer from Emerson, Lake and Palmer. That is what I've been doing for the past 20 years. And more recently, I've started writing my own material and touring, doing solo tours with that.
Fantastic. And I'm going to start with a question that'll take us a little off the path. We'll get back there just because I'm personally curious. How does a British prog rock guitar player end up in New Bedford, Massachusetts?
Well, back in 2011, I was doing a tour of the US with Carl Palmer, and I met a promoter at, first of all, it was a New Hampshire show, a Londonderry, New Hampshire, and then she was also promoting a show in Fall River, Massachusetts, and that promoter got more than she bargained for because she is now my wife.
Wow.
So, yeah, word of advice to all promoters, be careful who you book.
So the simple story of love and rock and roll.
Exactly.
Well, I'd love to start talking about the compositional piece because it sounds like that's a more recent thing, but the compositional works I know you for are your Nosferatu Undead show. Had you been writing before that, or was this kind of the starting point for really doing the deep dive into composition?
You know, I've always kind of written ideas and just I used to write for a guitar magazine in the UK, so to get around copyright laws would get me to write pieces in the style of various artists and guitarists. So I have been writing for a while, but my bread and butter job and bread and butter jobs has always been playing for other people. So I've been really a session musician. So my music has always taken a sideline until, of course, the great pandemic of 2020 came along and all touring stopped. All chances to play everyone else's music stopped. So I had, best part of 2 years in this room, in this studio, and I started writing. I saw it as an opportunity to start writing and to do all of these projects that I've always wanted to do but never had the time to. So really, it's since 2020 that I have been composing.
Where did the idea for Nosferatu Undead start?
The Nosferatu show, that is it's a live soundtrack to the 1922 movie, but also augmented with multimedia performance on different screens. So the idea for that came from me wanting to put together a show and go out and tour on my own, and realizing that it would probably be a lot more interesting if people would come along and see something more than me just playing guitar. So I wanted to give people something to look at. And the 100th anniversary of Nosferatu was coming up, so I thought, why not celebrate that by writing a soundtrack and putting together a multimedia show for that.
And not just a multimedia show, like you've got a band. When you did this show at Interwoven back in May, you had video screens with your fellow musicians. Who are the other people who are with you on this project?
That's right. Well, so on drums we have Mike Ducko. No, drums we have Leah Bluestein. Sorry, no, no coffee yet today. Drums we have Leah Bluestein. On bass we have Mike Dutko. Keyboards we have Jordan Rudess of Dream Theater. We also have Dave Bainbridge of Iona. We've got a few guest performances. So Arthur Brown, the god of hellfire himself, is doing narration, and amazing guitarist, my favorite guitarist, a guy called Ron Thal or Bumblefoot, is doing a guest solo as well. We also have members of the New Bedford Symphony Orchestra. We've got Peter Zay on cello. And there's probably other guests that are just escaping my mind at the moment. But yeah, that's the main kind of company of players.
I thought what was fun about, among the many things that were great about the show, is that, they recorded parts for this. Obviously, in a room like Interwoven, you can't have a full band in there. So, you can't fit more than 30 people in that room.
Yeah.
So you had, all these guest musicians on these two video screens, along with the production of Nosferatu behind you. So I have to ask, how did you pull all that together? Because it's such a complex presentation.
Yeah, that's right. It's well, I had the idea in mind, and then I just had to go out and find a solution for it. So basically, what I'm doing is I have three videos that are synced, not just with themselves, but with a separate backing track. And that backing track is also controlling everything on stage. So it's sending MIDI signals all around the stage to mute the theremin, which anybody who has played with a theremin live knows that it is very important to be able to mute the theremin for when it's not being used. But it's starting looper pedals, it's stopping looper pedals, it's doing all sorts of things. So yeah, very complex setup, and it's all being run from one kind of master file that's triggering everything. But I found some plugins, some VST plugins online, and they're made by a small company. It's actually software designed for film composers to sync music to, but you can use it in such a way that you can have several videos running in sync. So that's the software that I used. And coincidentally, now we are going out, when I go out with Carl Palmer, we're going out as the return of Emerson, Lake and Palmer. And we have Emerson on one screen and Lake on the other screen, because, of course, Emerson and Lake passed away in 2016, I think. So they're no longer with us, but they are with us on stage. And we are using exactly the same technology that I use for Nosferatu.
And when you're performing, it's not just guitar, and this is true with the ELP Legacy as well. Like, you're playing Keith Emerson's keyboard parts, but on guitar.
Yeah.
How do you pull that off?
Well, funnily enough, I use the tagline, rock guitar is trapped inside a classical pianist body. Or vice versa. Funnily enough, I've been always playing classical piano parts on guitar. When I was about 16, I fell in love with the piano, but, at the ripe old age of 16, I thought it's much too old. I'm much too old now to start changing my instrument. I've been playing guitar for a full 5 years. I don't want that 5 years to go to waste. So I started trying to arrange pieces, piano pieces on guitar. And part of me wishes I did play piano, but the other part of me thinks, well, I would just sound like everybody else on piano. And now I'm playing a lot of classical pieces on guitar. I think that training really helped me when Carl was looking for a guitar player. I sent him a CD, and it was of me playing lots of classical things. and I think he realized that that kind of link was going to be ideal for the band and ideal for me to slip into that role and start playing keyboard parts.
How do you recreate Keith Emerson's sonics?
Well, a number of ways. I could have had this hooked up to show you actually, but a number of ways. For the first, I've been playing with Carl for 20 years now, and I would say for the first, let me think about it. For the first 15 years, I played just using analog effects, and just using guitar pedals, but trying to eke every weird sound I could out of my guitar pedals to make them sound similar to Keith's synth sounds. And then in 2019, so in the band, the bass player is also using a lot of guitar pedals as well, and he was also using some MIDI stuff. Now in 2019, I discovered a piece of software called MIDI Guitar 2. And it was actually when we were due to go on tour with a different bass player, David Pistorius, who is the nephew of Jacko Pistorius. So we went on tour with him, and he doesn't use any pedals. So I thought I have to compensate here, so I have to up my game. So again, I did a bit of research and found some software called MIDI Guitar 2. Now, MIDI Guitar 2 basically takes whatever you play on guitar and converts it to MIDI. So then you can use any plugin you want. So you can have your guitar sounding like a Hammond organ or a Moog synthesizer. So really, the opportunities and possibilities are endless when you've got MIDI. So what I do is I will have my guitar always sounds like a screaming electric guitar in Carl's band, but also being doubled through the PA from my laptop will be a Moog synthesizer accompanying it, and it is doubling everything I play, or a Hammond doubling everything I play. So that's how I do it.
It's also a pretty big technological jump because once upon a time, if you wanted to do that with the guitar, you had a special pickup that would be lined into whatever
exactly
MIDI you were using, and now you can actually literally just plug the guitar in, and your laptop and that plugin are going to convert the sounds into MIDI notes that will play through those particular keyboard.
Exactly. It is astounding, yeah. It was developed by a guy. It's in a Scandinavian country, and I hope he doesn't listen to this. I can't remember what country he's from, but if I understand it right, he was developing some software for security at airports, and it was software that would listen for keywords being spoken kind of in a busy airport environment, to listen in case anyone's talking about bombs or whatever the keywords might be in an airport environment. And he took this technology that he developed. He was also a guitar player, and he thought, well, I can also use this technology to, in the same way, to discern what notes are being played on the guitar and multiple notes at the same time. So so it's actually technology that came from kind of a non-musical application.
That's wild. Just taking technology that has one use and saying, well, if it can do this thing that's totally different, it could also do this musical thing that nobody's really thought about applying it to.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
So, you gave Carl Palmer a CD, but how did you find out about the gig? How did you get in touch with him? Because I can't imagine you just find Carl Palmer, who's an absolute legend. That easy.
Yeah, so he was looking for a guitarist for this project. He the project was already up and running, and he was asking around, and he had a few recommendations. one of which was a guy called Guthrie Govan. And Guthrie Govan is, since the age of YouTube, and this was before the age of YouTube, really, that I joined the band. But since the age of YouTube, he is an absolute international phenomenon, and he really has changed guitar playing. He's had a big hand in what the modern guitar players are playing now. But he was recommended for the band, but he couldn't do it. He had other projects. In fact, one of them was Asia, which was Carl's old band. So he was a friend of mine, and he recommended me. I sent him a CD, and thankfully there was no audition. But Carl got my CD. Well, first of all, I called him and said, I found out about this gig. I heard you're looking for a guitar player. Would you mind if I sent you a CD? And he said, oh, well, actually, we've just found one. I'm really sorry. We've got a guitar player. But, send me your CD anyway. Maybe in future we can do something together. So at that point, I didn't have any way of sending him a CD. I didn't have a studio at home or anything. So I went to a friend's studio. I had a few things that I'd recorded in the past that I put together. I recorded a few more just in a day, sent them to him, and then, after 3 days, the 3 days that it took the Royal Mail to deliver them to him, because we weren't emailing stuff back then. So I mailed a physical CD, and then I got a phone call saying he loved the CD, and actually he'd prefer me to be the guitar player than this guy they'd already found. So
wow,
poor guy. We had this. I mean, and this guy, I do know him, and he is a great guitar player. I think maybe I was a little bit more suitable because of stylistically of my classical leanings, but this guy was is a phenomenal guitar player. But yeah, we did this guitar show together, like a big trade show, and I was telling people that I just got the gig with Carl Palmer, and this guy didn't know that Carl had got somebody else. So we were both going around this place saying that we were both playing with Carl Palmer, and it was a bit embarrassing.
I hope you recovered. That's rough, but also you have that classical background, which is so suited to Emerson, Lake and Palmer. It's like,
yeah, exactly. Yeah. It was. Yeah, I feel like my background was definite training for this band, for Carl's band.
And here you are still doing it 20 years later.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
What's it like to step into those shoes? Like, you're a guitar player, you're playing guitar parts while also playing Keith's parts. And, these are things that are going back 50 years in some cases.
Yeah.
What's it like to step into those pieces and play them?
It's at the start, it was quite. Well, it was a bit of a whirlwind of emotions, really, because at the start I was not familiar with ELP at all. I mean, I was familiar with the name, I was familiar with what they were about, mostly through kind of reading interviews of my modern prog heroes talking about their influence on them. So I wasn't really familiar with any of the pieces, and when I did my first tour with Carl, I realized how important that these pieces were to people, and that realization of me playing these pieces that I'm not too familiar with, but these people have kind of they're the soundtracks to their lives. It kind of it put the pressure on, or certainly it made me realize how important these pieces were. So yeah, at that point I did start taking more of an interest into the music of ELP and really getting to know it really well, so I could perform it really well.
Is the set list generally pretty locked in, or does Carl look to mix things up from tour to tour?
We, I mean, in the past, we've mixed things up from tour to tour. There was a few tours where we Carl only likes to play one epic piece, so that's usually Tarkus or Pictures at an Exhibition. So they're both kind of 30-minute pieces. He doesn't like to do both of those. So there were tours where Carl would ask, which do you want to hear, Tarkus or Pictures, and we'd play a different one every night. But now we're doing the show with the big screens. So we've got 3 huge LED screens with us, showing Keith and Greg on each side, and then kind of videos in the middle. So because that is such a kind of prescribed show that has to run like clockwork, there's very little variation that we can have in that show.
You have to lock it in, just like you have to lock it in for Nosferatu, because the movie's
exactly
not for you.
Exactly. The movie, the people on the screens are not going to change what they're playing. Yeah, exactly.
So what got you into guitar in the first place?
I grew up with my dad playing guitars, so there were always guitars around the house. But the person who made me want to play guitar, like hero, was Mark Knopfler. And I remember hearing Money for Nothing for the first time. I remember hearing Sultans of Swing and just thinking, I want to do that. First I went for classical guitar lessons and really didn't do much with it, didn't do very well with it, because I'd be playing classical guitar in my lesson and then I'd go home and listen to Dire Straits or whatever on electric guitar, and it was almost like it wasn't even the same instrument. But as soon as I started playing electric guitar and actually learning the songs that I was listening to, I really got the bug.
And what got you into prog? Because it's kind of a leap from Dire Straits to whatever mod, like Dream Theater, for instance.
So from Dire Straits, I got into lots of different guitar players. For me, when I was a teenager, I didn't really care what the band sounded like. I didn't really care what the music sounded like. If they had a good guitar player, I was going to listen to them. So yes, but I mean that's not a slight against prog in any way. But naturally, prog rock has technical, very good guitar players. So that's what drew me towards prog rock. But before that, I always say that I've been drawn towards prog rock. My listening, as my nursery rhymes were the Beatles, thanks to my dad and my mum. So I feel like the Beatles were the start of prog. Sergeant Pepper and Abbey Road.
Yep.
The B-side of Abbey Road. They're prog rock epics. They're concept albums. So I do feel like that was definitely some groundwork laid there.
Who do you look at as your big influences? You mentioned one earlier, I think.
Yeah. So Mark Knopfler would be a big influence. So from Mark Knopfler, I got really into the blues guys. So Eric Clapton, Jimi Hendrix, Stevie Ray Vaughan, and then I got into more of the kind of the 80s and 90s. I guess you'd call them shredders, but I feel like that's a derogatory term. But Steve Vai, Joe Satriani, and then classical music has been a huge influence as well. So I do see my influences. I'm probably just as influenced by classical musicians as I am by guitarists. So one big influence, one big hero of mine is a pianist called George Cifra, who was a Hungarian pianist from Budapest, and he has an amazing life story. There's a great biography of his called Cannons and Flowers. If you can get hold of it, it's an autobiography all about how he lived through the war, and he was this child prodigy in Budapest, and but then he joined the war, and then he fled from the army by stealing a train and crossing enemy lines and joining the Red Army, and it's an incredible biography. But George Seifert he just incredible musician. So yeah, I'd say I'm influenced by people who aren't guitarists as well.
I want to get back to Nosferatu for a moment because a couple of things. I want to talk a little bit about how you connected with some of the different collaborators. You mentioned Leah. The different people who play in the show. How did you know them, and how did you recruit them into the project?
Mike and Leah, I met them at a gig in New Bedford at the Vault, and they come to see a band. I think it could have been Quiet Riot, and Katie, my wife, it was her company JKB booking them. JKB have also done the booking for this coming Nosferatu tour. But yeah, they booked them, and Mike and Leah were there, and I was introduced to them and just got a good feeling about them. They both, they both just left Berkeley. They both just seemed really nice, really friendly, really eager. I think one of them mentioned that they were in the Dream Theater cover band at Berkeley, and I thought, well, they must be able to play. So that really was just getting a good vibe about them. And then I saw Leah on social media as well, and Leah has got a huge social media following. She's got like over 100,000 followers on Instagram. So there's definitely a buzz going on about her, and they just come across as like really friendly, really nice people. So I'd never played with them, and we booked the Nosferatu show in Fall River last year, and it was a big success. So yeah, a gut feeling paid off.
No kidding. And it's funny because having watched it in May at Interwoven, like you start feeling like they're in the room with you because you can see, even though they're on video screens now, they'll actually physically be with you this fall when you're sure with it, right?
That's right. Yeah.
In terms of Jordan Rudess from Dream Theater, how did you connect with him?
So Jordan was we've always been for a while we've been friends on like social media, but Jordan is a huge Keith Emerson fan, so I think that was kind of our link there. And then over the pandemic, we did an online prog project called Prog from Home, one of the first kind of lockdown projects when lots of artists would do stuff. I think he did something, I did something, and he messaged me after that, and then so it kind of came slowly through messaging, and then we've grown as friends. I've got a Patreon page, and I helped him set up his, and so yeah. Funnily enough, actually, I did tour with Dream Theater. Did 2 shows with them back in 2010, I think it was. And I played with an artist called Neil Morse, and we opened up for Dream Theater a couple of times in Europe. And obviously, I remember very clearly meeting them all, but Jordan doesn't remember meeting me then. But that was the first time I met him.
And what about the MBSO players? I mean, they're local, obviously, but
yeah,
go knocking on the Z or whatever.
No. Peter, I can't remember exactly how it happened, but I got friendly with Peter by I attended a couple of like meetings with a view to getting involved with like local teaching. That the New Bedford Symphony Orchestra was doing around the area, and it didn't happen. And then me and Peter were going to do a show together because I gave them all one of my classical CDs. I've got my solo album is me playing lots of classical music. So I gave Peter one of those CDs, and then he asked me to do a gig, and shortly before it, I got an injury in my shoulder. So couldn't do that, and we finally got together over this.
Is there going to be a soundtrack album?
Absolutely, yes. There's quite a few tracks recorded already. So Bumblefoot has done all of his parts. Jordan Rudess has done all of his parts. The plan is immediately after our October tour, so the Nosferatu tour is going on tour from the 19th of October to the 29th of October. And immediately after that, we're going to go into a studio for a few days and record guitar, bass, and drums. And that will be the bulk of it recorded. And we'll be looking at a release sometime early next year.
And I would love to talk about your Patreon, because that's a huge thing for you. And it sounds like it was huge from a financial standpoint, particularly during COVID.
Sure.
You couldn't tour, you couldn't really get out and play.
For sure, yeah.
What prompted you to start the Patreon? Was that a COVID thing, or had that been up and running beforehand?
No, it wasn't a COVID thing. No, I'd been doing it for a couple of years before. What prompted it? I think I first heard about Patreon because it was in the early days of Patreon. I first heard about Patreon where I was on some sort of live stream with people talking about kind of different income streams, and one of the questions in the chat was, "What about Patreon?" And the simple answer from the host was, "Oh, we're not going to talk about that here. We're talking about a different subject." I was like, "Oh, what is Patreon?" So I Googled it and thought, this sounds really, really good. So when I played with Neil Morse, so I joined Neil Morse's European band in 2007. He had, for want of a better phrase, a fan club called the Inner Circle, and he would send out CDs every 2 months to everyone on the Inner Circle, and then he'd record a CD just for them. And I always thought it was a great idea. I always thought it'd be a cool thing to do. And I saw that Patreon was an opportunity to do that. And so I did a similar sort of thing. My whole, I say that the pandemic helped me start writing. Well, really, in truth, it was Patreon plus the pandemic that helped me start writing, because I was writing for my Patreon patrons, and I actually did a crazy pledge that for every person who joined, I would write them a song each. And,
wow.
Yeah. Yeah. So I'm still working through them, but
I believe it.
Yeah. Yeah. So Patreon is it for me. It's a win-win. Obviously, it's financial security when I'm not touring, but also it's accountability. I know I have people waiting for me to do things. I've promised that I'm going to do things, therefore I have to do it. It's Patreon has been fantastic for me.
And it's also a community of people,
exactly,
artists.
Yeah,
It's huge as well.
Exactly, and it's a community within my Patreon group as well. Every morning at 9 a.m. We meet on Discord for Discord is like a chat thing where you can do video chat as well for breakfast in the Beehive, we call it, and every weekday morning 9 a.m. Everything about Patreon and usually everything I do work wise, it is as a result of me trying to trick myself into doing things. So over the pandemic, I found that like a lot of people, I wasn't getting up till noon, and then I'd go into the studio, and by the time wait a minute, it's lunch now, so let's have some lunch, and by the time I'd had lunch and several coffees, I maybe get 2 hours of work done, and then, well, it's time for dinner now. You can't work past dinner time. So I thought I need to make myself accountable. So I started this thing called Beehive Breakfast, where at 9 o'clock I would have to be in the studio because there were patrons waiting for me on Discord, and we would watch like a masterclass or a documentary or something like that. Now we just hang out, but back then we'd watch a masterclass, and we'd start our day that way. And I was in the studio. I had my coffee in hand. I had my guitar within reach, and I would start straight away. So I tricked myself into being productive.
How does a typical morning session like that look?
On you mean
The
on
Beehive.
Discord, the Beehive? Well, so it varies. It varies from morning to morning. As I say, we used to. There's a great site called Masterclass, which has a load of masterclasses on there. So there's masterclasses with all sorts of famous people, actors, musicians, and so we always used to watch that for 30 minutes and kind of chat uh, while it was on, chat over it. It was just a really inspiring way to start the day. Then it's been a while since we've done that. So sometimes we just kind of get together, chat. Orlok, my cat, loves going for walks. So very often we will take Orlok for a walk, and I'll video it, and we'll chat, and it's like a little live stream, and everyone's, but it's so much more. It's become so much more than me and whatever the content is. So we're all keeping up on how everyone's doing. So, like this morning, there's a lady called Michelle, and her cat's just been to the vet. So we were asking about how that's going, and chatting about that. We all know what's going on in each other's lives.
It's
Yeah,
beautiful.
yeah. It's a really good community. It's which is what I was hoping to take out to make out of the Patreon page. I wanted to make something bigger than just me. And what's great is sometimes I can't make Beehive Breakfast, and it always carries on without me. And I'm sure it's always just as good. I'm just another member in the Beehive Breakfast.
When you create something and it keeps itself going, that's pretty amazing.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. It
I
really
wanted to
is.
ask about Neil Morse because I'm not familiar with him, but you've mentioned him a couple of times. You're in his band.
Yeah,
Could you talk about Neil and how you connected with him and started working with him?
yeah. So Neil was in a band called Spock's Beard, and Spock's Beard was one of my favorite bands when I was like late teenager. So when I got the opportunity to come to the US for the first time in 2006, I with Carl Palmer, I basically, coming to America. I'm from a tiny country where you can drive anywhere in it in a day, anywhere, and often in just a few hours. So, so coming from that perspective, I thought I'm going to contact all of my heroes in the US because I'm coming to the US and invite them to come to a show. And So I contacted Neil, and he got back and I knew Neil was an ELP fan as well. So Neil got back to me saying, unfortunately, you're not playing within, I don't know, 500 miles of me. Oh yeah, wait a minute, I forgot that America was so big. So you're not playing within 500 miles of me, but thanks for the email. And that was that. And then a while later, maybe I think a year later, the next year, I got an email from him saying, "Want to do a gig?" And it turned out that somebody, one of the promoters that we'd used in Barcelona, had mentioned me to him, and Neil said, "Oh yeah, I know that guy. He contacted me," and just kind of, you know, he remembered me. He remembered the recommendation when he got the recommendation for a guitarist, and he was looking for a guitarist. He remembered my email and our conversation, and that was that. So that's how I got with him. But yeah, so he was in a band called Spock's Beard, and then he went solo, and I was in his solo band, his European solo band.
When was the
Well,
last time you performed with him?
last time I performed with him, he wrote a musical that I performed on. I think it might have been 2019, 18, something like that. Yeah, time flies.
Yeah.
But yeah, he wrote a musical. Every year he does a festival called Morsefest, in his home of Nashville, and it's like a 3-day festival. and it is just the most intense for a musician to play Fest. It is the most intense experience because you got to learn this, hours of intense music. And he asked me to be the guitarist at Morsfest a few years ago, and it was just unbelievable amount of work. But as is always the case, unbelievable amount of satisfaction at the end of it.
I was just going to say, I love that it took place in noted prog rock capital, Nashville.
I know. Yeah. Well, noted country musician here that I am. I actually played the Grand Ole Opry in
Oh, nice.
in Nashville in 2019. And everyone I told, or everyone who looked at the tour dates, was absolutely gushing over it. And I had to Google what it was because I'd never heard of it.
I'm so old that when I was a kid, my parents, who were country music fans, every week on syndicated TV, there would be Night at the Grand Ole Opry, and I would sit
Right.
and watch it with them. It's like, it's a legendary place, but,
Yeah.
if you're, grow up in England, it
Exactly.
doesn't have that connection because it's
No.
part of that whole sphere of Americana that you're not going to be familiar with out of the gate.
Exactly. Yeah. Yeah. I'd never heard of it. Yeah. Yeah. We did the tour. I was more reverent after the tour of the backstage, but
It's like going to Fenway Park, but you're British. It's like, okay, great. It's a baseball field. It's got a
that's
big ball.
exactly it. Exactly.
Paul, is
Yeah.
there anything you'd like to talk about that we haven't touched on?
I mean, I've got my tour coming up, so my two local gigs coming up are in Fall River at the Narrows Centre for the Arts and in Arlington, Massachusetts at the Regent Theatre. And the Fall River show is on the 28th of October and the Arlington show is on the 29th of October.
Well, I'm looking forward to seeing you on the 28th in Fall River, and I think my brother's coming down for that one. So
Fantastic.
and we're going to hit
Fantastic.
King's X at the Vault the night before, so it should be
Oh, amazing. Oh,
double-headed.
I might be there for that as well.
All right.
Yeah, because it looks like we haven't got a gig that night, so I'll probably go down
Right.
to that.
Hope to
Yeah.
see you there. I do
Yeah.
have 5 final questions for you that I like to
All
ask
right.
all the musicians I interview. First
Okay.
of all, what's your first musical memory?
Oh, first musical memory. Probably it would be singing Beatles songs with my dad. So my dad played guitar. I remember singing Yellow Submarine was a particular favorite. So yeah, that would probably be my. But I tell that might not be true because the piece Claire de Lune has always had a real strong resonance with me. And it wasn't until my teenage years that I'd mentioned that. And my mum said, "Oh yeah, that'll be because when you were still in the womb, we used to play that piece to you a lot. That was the piece that would calm you down. If you kind of
Kicking in there?
yeah, exactly, yeah, yeah.
All
Used to
right. So
play
your
that,
musical
yeah,
memory goes back to
yeah.
pre-birth, which
Exactly, yeah,
that's amazing.
yeah, yeah.
What is one record you would have to take to a desert island?
I would have to say it's not one record, but it's one box set, the complete Beethoven symphonies.
All right.
Yeah.
You may have already mentioned someone who qualifies as this, so you might have to think of someone else. Someone who is a super sneaky secret influence, somebody that they would hear you and not peg as an influence, kind of like Mark Knopfler.
Yeah, okay. Kurt Cobain.
All right.
Yeah, Nirvana. Yeah, I was huge into Nirvana, and I do feel like hopefully I carry because I do play what sounds like a lot more technical music than Nirvana might seem, but I hopefully carry the spirit of Nirvana in my playing, in my music.
Got it. Beautiful.
Yeah.
Musician, living or dead, you wish you could work with.
I'd go with one of the great classical composers. I've already mentioned Beethoven, so I'm going to go Rachmaninoff.
All right.
If Rachmaninoff could write something that I could play, I would love to have collaborated on that.
Beautiful. Last question. What is your South Coast happy place?
South Coast happy place. You know, I really like hiking through the woods around here, and I've hiked through most of the woods around here. So yeah, I like going through all of the trails, the woodlands. I do. I go there under the guise of a treasure hunt game called geocaching, but often just enjoy the woods and just being alone, getting lost in the woods. So yeah,
Wonderful.
I'd say the woodland.
Paul, thank you so much for taking time out to talk. It's been great. Love the Nosferatu show. I'm looking forward to seeing you in Fall River, and have a great time taking it on tour this fall.
Thank you so much, Scott. Great speaking to you. Thanks for having me.
Thanks for joining us for another In Focus podcast, which is generously sponsored in part by Heavenly Spirits Importers and funded in part with grants from the New Bedford Cultural Council and the Fairhaven Cultural Council, local agencies supported by the Mass Cultural Council, a state agency. I'm Scott Bishop, and thanks for listening to The Artist's Index.